He has the PowerPoint. So.
And we're now live.
Good evening, everyone. So happy that you've been able to join us again for our spirituality and trauma series. And this evening, we have blessed to have
He has the
PowerPoint. Bobby Simpson Epps, who will present on historical trauma, especially as it impacts the African American community. Her work is focused on historical, generational, and multi-generational trauma and the solutions of the neuroscience, that is the neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experience, and resilience. I know that Bobby has a particular background in the adverse childhood experience. And so we welcome Bobby. And Bobby, so good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I am really always honored to be in the presence of Okogie and the ASTIC staff. They are just so extremely knowledgeable. I'm really going to be talking about understanding. You can go to the slide deck if you'd like, Blake, so that they can see it. And I welcome all of you as you're looking at the slides to put things in chat, or if you have questions to state them in the chat. And those of you who are on Zoom, just simply jump into the conversation. I don't like to talk at people. I like to be present with people. So next slide. So what I really want to talk about is how you understand race-based trauma, how it presents itself, and how it impacts all of us. I want you to be able to identify it and recognize it in ourselves and in others. When I wish I would have put more slides in here around the history of this country, but I think it's a lot. It's more important to look at how we are showing up around the trauma attached to race and how we live within ourselves with that level of trauma. And what are the practices that we can put in place so that the trauma doesn't take over our lives, so that the trauma doesn't make us ill long-term? Because there's certainly lots of side effects that come from the trauma that resides in our body. And then I will be talking about spirituality and race-based trauma. Next slide, please. So when I think about race, we all know that race is really something that was constructed. It's not natural. There's no cultural concept or political. It is a political ideology, and it's not a scientific classification or a biological fact. I think we are used to talking about race because it distinguishes us between the groups in America. And I think America may be one of the only countries that really looks at race as a way to characterize people, to explain and identify people, to talk about people in a context that may or may not be true. A trauma, on the other hand, is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It's personal. It's something that you don't have control over. It's something that happens. And trauma can be prolonged, or it could be something that is short term. But it also is a second definition of that is a physical injury or rupture or something that is traumatizing. And when I say physical, it can be something that you see that is traumatized, but trauma physically can also be things that you don't see. Next slide. So here's this whole concept of race. And when we talk about race, it's something that was put into place to justify racial slavery and slaveholding interests. and to really uplift a certain group of people rather than other people. So in America, the racial groups that we really talk about are white people, which are known as Caucasian or white American. Red is the color associated with Native Americans. Black is the color associated with African Americans, yellow with Asian Americans, and brown with Hispanic American and or Latinx people. This thing called race I found it to be really, really interesting because as we look over this country, certainly, race has identified who we are, where we are, and to a large extent, what we're supposed to be doing or where we're supposed to be standing or a status that we have. Race has been one of the things from a white perspective that has kind of taken over the world. Because even if you go to other countries, you will find women who are bleaching their skin to be whiter and lighter. What's associated with the skin color white is that it's more pure, it's more refined, and it's right, especially when you look at skin. Even during the time of slavery, there were slaves or enslaved people. I want to correct my language around that. There were enslaved people that were biracial, and the lighter skinned folks that were enslaved were separated from the darker skinned and were able to get those jobs that were probably a lot more endearing. And even among the other ethnic groups, Asian Americans, particularly, and some Native American and Hispanic Americans have an opportunity to blend in a bit more because they are lighter skinned, even with the hue that's associated with their particular ethnic group or racial group.
Bobby,
Yes,
I understood that you were inviting us to.
I am. So
uh,
I'd love to have you say something about it.
Yeah, one thing I noticed here, in my experience, for Asians, yellow is no longer used, and that's just from my experience. And
So
for me,
is there a different color that is used or no
well,
color?
I mean, they are usually grouped in the brown category,
Okay.
and of recent years, I have perceived any reference to Asians as yellow in itself as racist.
Okay. That's good to know. I will change that in my slide.
You
And
might you might check with others, but that is how I've never heard an Asian person in recent years refer to themselves as yellow, but as brown.
And I like that because, as I said, there's none of us that know everything. And I will be checking that out with many of my Asian American friends across the country because we have these rich dialogues about race and about colorism. And we'll talk about that later in this session. So thanks a lot for that. Let's go to the next slide. So let's talk about how do you define race-based trauma. It really is trauma that is associated with race. It refers to the mental and emotional injury that is caused or encountered with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. The one thing that I would say about race-based trauma is that it happens all over America. There are people within the city that have been traumatized, especially I hate to go to the events of the past 14 to 15 months, but they have been significant. They've been significant not only because of COVID-19 and the association with a particular racial group, whereas the China virus and the many, many fights and atrocities that have happened to our Asian sisters and brothers individually and collectively because of it being identified that way. But the trauma around race is something that no one in America gets to escape. For instance, in December of 2020, there was an incident in rural white America around a political fight that had to do with people who were white that were working in the health department. And they actually went into the health department to abrupt that meeting because they didn't want to deal with what was happening with COVID-19. And as some of white people were at others' homes who were in that health department, threatening their children, almost going into their homes. And so when I talk about race-based trauma and the trauma that comes, we hear a lot about people of color, but it also is traumatizing for white America based on the emotions that are tied to a particular incident, to a particular subject. And we don't hear enough about white on white kinds of activities and crime. So I'm bringing that up because that is race-based trauma, just in the same way that people talk about crime in the Black community that continues to happen among Black individuals. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of race on individuals. Over the years, we have seen lots of mass shootings of Hispanic Americans or Latinx people. We've seen the mass shootings in El Paso. We've seen incidents that have happened to individuals who speak the Spanish language, so much so that people are often walking up to them and telling them they need to go back where they came from. Also, we've seen what's happening with immigrants trying to come into our borders. The impact of what has happened to so many of those children at our borders will be something that will not be able to be undone. The trauma that they have sustained in those environments where they have been treated less than human. And so when we think about the impact of race on individuals and the things that we do, it doesn't stop right with that person. Those are things that are carried on for generations to come. I talked a little bit about the Asian Americans and the COVID-19 being called the China virus, but we have seen multiple attacks on Asian Americans. I have reached out to my Asian American, Hispanic American friends and really talked with them and offered my support as I have found them fighting the same battle that I as a Black person fight, simply based on the color of my skin. The other thing that has happened with Native Americans to me is one of the greatest sins of America, to take a people's land and then to subdue them to annihilation for the most part, simply because this was their land. I believe they were subjected to more than 1,500 wars and attacks and raids that were authorized by our government. Do you think that that did not have a long-term impact on those generations? When I talk about epigenetics and intergenerational and multi-generational trauma, this is a group of people who have been in the throes of that for actually centuries. And what we see today, we see Native American children on the reservations across the state of Minnesota. Many of the teenagers, they have the highest rate of suicide than any other group in the state of Minnesota. They are hopeless. They don't see things changing for them. And it's because of their race. It's because of their circumstance. It's because of the systems and structures in place that have left them in a place of hopelessness, not believing that they can achieve greatness, not believing that they can do better than where they are. And then we look at the many encounters with African Americans, the continued killing of individuals based on their race, based on the portrayal of who they are, based on their worth. We see that continually. And I have listed here some of the killings that have taken place. But what are the perceived threats that happen when people see the police or other folks coming? I've named these ethnic groups, these racial groups, the Hispanic, Asian, Native, and African American. There's always this tenseness for us, not only among police and among authority figures, but between and amongst us. And why is that? It's part of a larger process, a larger context around how we are pitted against each other. It's not by accident. One of the things that I was truly concerned about with the Asian American atrocities is when I saw a Black man kick an Asian American woman in the stomach, knock her to the ground, and began kicking her, a Black man rather, and began kicking her in the head. I was hurt. And I did not find one African American that wanted to stand behind him. Why would he do that to another member of our society who has been outcast, who has been demonized and talked about because of their race? I believe that this internal oppression that we feel with and amongst each other is something that has to be dealt with. And we haven't talked about that. So, and now I want to get to white America. There is this mystique, this misinformation that they escape the impact of race, and they have not. I think about what is the history, lives inside of them as white Americans that are now, and I say white Americans because they didn't come here as white Americans. They came here as Polish, they came here as British, they came here as Germans, they came here as Scottish. They came here from Germany, they came from other countries, European countries. And in their coming, they had to give up so much of who they are to be accepted by white America. And it didn't come when they arrived. It came with a price. They had to give up a lot of who they are. They had to give up a sense of being and a sense of purpose. And so white America, because of the privileges that they have, they too are afraid of the people that look like me and other people because they have a belief about who we are. And there's this daily fear of people who are not white. Let's go to the next slide. So when I talk about systemic racism and what happens with Native Americans, there is a lack of cultural competency around understanding who they are. There is a hope for Native Americans as they fight to maintain their language and maintain their culture. But yet and still, there are financial barriers that they fight against. There is geographical isolation that has been created in our country. Not all reservations are as rich as one of our local ones. And then to me, that might be even a misnomer. All I know is what I see and what I hear. But I would really like to know more about that particular community. But I do know about Little Earth. I know that it's the only rural reservation in our country. And I have seen the systems of racism that has hurt that particular community over many decades here in the Twin Cities. I've talked to the mothers and the men. I've talked to the young people who live there, and they're constantly battling with police. They're constantly battling with not having enough. But yet they survive and they're still here. But the systemic racism in our country against Native American communities is harmful and it is hurtful. And we'll talk about some of the health issues that they have attached to the racism, attached to the lack of food, attached to a lot of the trauma that they carry in their bodies. In the African American people, and they're about 12%, we make up 12% of the country in terms of population size, and even less than that here in Minnesota. But we make up over 33% of the total prison population in America. And this is a 2019 statistic. And so I'm sure it's higher than that now. And so the systems what gets us to the prison system is not just the police by itself. There are things that happen early on: the poverty, the lack of opportunity for students, the pushing out of our school system of teachers, not accepting them as who they are, always looking and prodding for what they're doing wrong, never building them up. The classes that are taught, the lack of teachers that look like them, the lack of people who are in decision-making roles that look like them. All of those things are systemic in nature, and it's really hard for me to go into one community after another, especially when I go into schools in North Minneapolis, anywhere in the Twin Cities, and I don't see enough people of color in decision-making roles. I don't see a lot of people who are teachers. I see a lot of people who are aides, but I don't see people who are teachers running classrooms, deciding on what the curriculum is, deciding on the books that our children read, deciding on the stories that are told, figuring out those who gave gifts to every subject area that you can imagine, whose names are never mentioned. In our history books, the history is not told. When I think about Asian Americans, I think about Harvard's affirmative action policy that continues in this country today. And it has a long history of pitting people of color against each other. In this case, the Asians against the African Americans and Latinos, to advance the interests of white Americans. When the term model minority was coined, it was coined at that university. And the New York Times in 1966 ran an article about that. What is a model minority? That means they're quiet. Supposedly they're quiet. Supposedly they don't speak up. And they just want to blend in and not rank any feathers. All of these things have been depicted many and many times over. Even in the US News and World Report, it was depicted that Chinese Americans as winning wealth and respect by their own hard work, as if no one else deserved wealth or respect because of their own hard work. It's this depiction of who people are, how they're praised, and how they're elevated or how they're diminished. That's part of the system. In Hispanic America, we've seen all of the Hispanic Latinx people who are across this country, who are working hard and trying to make it. A lot of them are essential workers and on the front line, but they have borne a disproportionate part or share of the COVID-19 virus. Many of them have died. Many of them have lost their wages because they work in the entertainment and the service industries, in hotels, in restaurants. They don't have jobs, and the pandemic has pushed them even farther out. Those are systems in place, and these people are suffering. We continue to hear about the number of deaths. We continue to hear about the lack of housing. We continue to hear about the economic vulnerability around and abound to this population of people. But what has systemic racism done to white Americans? You know, it's easy for us oftentimes to talk about those who lives in the mountains of Tennessee and think that is the only place where poverty meets white America. There are white Americans all in every state, in every town, who live in poverty, who don't have class or status. But for some of them, because they're white, They feel that they're above any of these other groups that I have mentioned. So systemic racism helps them elevate themselves even when they are hurting. It helps them separate themselves even when they are hurting. Let's go to the next slide and jump in at any point, Marie and Yaman, whenever you feel like it.
I just had a question,
Uh-huh.
and it relates to maybe the previous slide, but something that relates to the last day's verdict
Uh-huh.
and the, you know, the Chauvin conviction. My white brother is married to an Ojibwe woman from Red Lake,
Mm-hmm.
and they are more aligned with the Blue Lives Matter take on things, because my sister-in-law's father was murdered by a white crack addict. And so having those conversations across experience, I mean, the usual breakdown doesn't seem to apply because the experience is so different.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just curious if you had any insights on, you know, when a perspective doesn't really seem to fit, but that's where the person is.
I think a lot of it, and I've heard this time and time again, and I think a lot of it is who is in their network and where do they live? What are the stories that they've been told? And what do they want to hold on to that might elevate them, even when reality says it's something different? I see that, and you know, your Native American sister-in-law
Yeah.
being married to a white man. Is that it? Was that I heard?
Yeah.
You don't know who their friends are and what the dialogue is.
Right.
The location that they live, the safety associated with what they believe and the values that they hold. All of those things come into play. You know, you're talking about a Native American married to a white man, but there are Black people not married to a white man that are sitting inside of spiritual institutions, churches, and we can see them on TV, or I've seen them all the time. And I know some of them that go to predominantly white churches where they don't believe in COVID-19. They supported the former person in the White House and believed every word that he said, even when he taunted, look, I got a Black person over there. Look, that one over there. It was like that hurt me to my core. While there were other Black people standing, he could point out and say, I got one. What does that remind you of? And what is the sense of belonging that they need to have? People attached to things where they have a sense of belonging, where they have a value that they think is inherent. And for many of the Black Christians, as far as I know, they were tied to abortion, as if none of the other things that we heard about were equal as sinful. So that's just my take. I'd be interested to hear what Okogie thinks around that.
All of that makes sense to me, Bobby. And you know, the context that people are in that you identified, the conversations that surround them, all this acting as a kind of force as to how they should think and live their lives. So I would just underline what you have said. It makes good sense to me in terms of It's so hard to know exactly, but all of those things would need to be taken into account.
Okay, next slide. This
Wanted to
next
share
slide.
something. I wanted to share something from someone
Yes.
following on YouTube. Celeste writes more about the previous slide, the impact of race on individuals and white Americans.
Okay.
She writes, I would add for whites that are becoming more aware of the benefits of white privilege, that there is shame, guilt without knowing our ancestors were part of the ethnic cleansing, looting of native lands, Black bodies, and oppression on anyone deemed different or inferior, and that we still benefit from systemic racism and don't know how to affect change.
Mhm, mhm. And the real truth around this historical and intergenerational trauma is those things rise up in us even when we don't know it. There are parts of my ancestry when I walk into Midtown Commons, for instance, and I smell an aroma and it smells familiar to me, and it's nothing that I've ever cooked with. There's music that I hear, and I know I've never heard that music before, yet there's a connection there. Our history lives inside of us, and it's passed down from generation to generation to generation. And as much as the rich things are passed down, some of those same negative things are passed down. We'll talk about issues like alcoholism as being something that's passed down, but we won't talk about hate. We won't talk about violence. We won't talk about sexual immorality being passed down. When I think about the enslaved people that were brought to this country, especially in my native state where my parents and my ancestors came to, Mississippi. Mississippi was a breeding state. It wasn't that those men nor those women, those boys nor those girls wanted to have sex with everybody around, but those women had to produce a baby at least every 18 to 24 months. And who do they breed them with? They bred them with, and I say breed because that's the way they treated the men and the women, the young women and the young boys. If they were strong, if they thought they could make something that would be worthy, that they could not only work to death, but sell at a higher rate, that's what was happening. How do you think that made those young people feel, those men and women feel, the fathers that couldn't protect their women, the women that couldn't protect their children, the white women who were angry because the slave owners were sleeping with those that were enslaved? There is so much embedded in each of us. And when I think about white America, I think about a deep hate, not just against people of color, but against themselves, against their history. And I say that because how can you leave church on a Sunday morning and pack a picnic to go see people hanged in a tree? How does a child interpret that when you just taught the word of God that says you should love your neighbor as yourself? So when I talk about the impact of race and trauma, the anxiety, depression, digestive problems, headaches, heart disease, all of that are things that are activated due to stress responses in our system and an overexposure to cortisol. And cortisol is a good thing in your body, but too much of it, it can help kill you, and the other stress hormones that follow. All of that disrupts almost all of how your body process should work. And it puts you at risk of all kinds of long-term health implications. So let's go to slide number 9. Well, this slide right here, really slide 8, just looks at what we already know about the lifetime risk of being killed by police in the United States by sex and race and ethnicity. I think that this slide is hard for me to look at. And this was put out by the National Academy of Science in 2019. It's hard for me to look at because just at that moment yesterday, when I shouted and I cried with tears of joy. I shouted and danced because all I could see was a strange fruit hanging in the tree. And having known that there were members of my family that were hung from trees, members of my family that died for no cause at all, I rejoiced about that. And within a matter of less than 2 hours, I got a call saying that a 15-year-old young Black girl had been shot 4 times in the chest. She called the police for help. And unfortunately, it was her demise. So when I look at these killings, and there's so many, many more, as we all know, this causes me trauma. I'm traumatized just looking at it. I'm traumatized, but because I don't want to be a part of that group. I don't want to be a part of all these families that are now on TV, that now have a collective experience. That's one group I never want to join. And I know many of you feel the same way. But the risk of being killed by police, by these groups is real. Look at the numbers. Look at that diagram. I don't think anybody could dispute that. And for Black females, I think this diagram doesn't give us just due. I think it's more than that. We can go to the next slide. So the neurological impact of race-based trauma, really, they're built over time. You know, when babies are born, they're born innocent. They're born hoping and experiencing life. They don't even cry normally until somebody hits them, and then they shout out. But a strong foundation for healthy development in young children really requires some love, some attention, some support from those who are supposed to be caring for them. But for many of our children, and we know this to be true, they are in places where the levels of stress is what we call toxic because it's constant and it's not disrupted. And when you have constant trauma, it sets your system in a place where later on in life, you're going to have some problems. And along the pathway of life, you're going to have some problems. This high persistent levels of stress disrupts everything that is being developed in our brains and the other parts of our biological system, so much so that some of the things that you need when you are in your early teens, that you need as you move up the rank till you're about 33, they're not there. They're gone. They were burned out and lost along the way. So we see mental health issues. We see people who don't function well in a classroom. We see people that can't sit in the dark sometime. We see people who don't like people walking up behind them. We see elementary students in school that can't sit still. And when they can't sit still, rather than trying to figure out the problem, they blame the child. And what do? They penalize them more, not realizing that for some children, and I wish I'd put that slide in here, for some children, by the time they enter kindergarten, their brain looks like they've had a stroke. It looks like any adult who has had a stroke because of the high levels of stress. So they go in and they have a medical issue that is not even being considered. And then they're penalized on top of that. And what happens? We don't correct it. We just elevate it. And they are put on a path of not ever for many of them, ever being able to achieve or live a full, healthy life in our society. So when any of us feel threatened, our body's stress response system is activated. Most of the time, when you hear a loud noise and you're not ready for it, you jump. And if you're really threatened and you're trying to get out of the way, your heart starts pounding and your blood pressure goes up. Your stress hormone levels are elevated. Your blood sugar rises. There's an inflammatory response. They're all mobilized because they're getting you ready to take care of yourself. And think about it. For some kids, they live in that all day long. And I want to say, don't just think it's Black kids. Don't just think that it's Native kids or Hispanic kids. Don't even think it's Asian kids. It happens to all kids with adults who are living in a world that they're not balanced and they haven't gotten the mental health issues that they are having to live with and have lived with taken care of. So we all know what it feels like physically when we're really stressed out. But for most of us, I believe that when we're really stressed out, we can take a day or an hour and we can stop. But for many people, that's a luxury. That's a dream that they think about. They can't do it. So this persistently elevated stress hormones disrupts your brain circuits that affect your memory, your ability to focus attention, and regulate your behavior. Have you ever seen anybody and think they don't have any social cues? Anybody? I've been with people that don't really have social cues, that don't know how to be in a room with people, that don't know how to interact with other adults. So the excessive inflammation and metabolic responses to stress in childhood increase the risk of heart disease, diabetes, depression, and many other chronic illnesses in the adult years. Example of a child's separation from parents of the border. I talked about that. All of these children, and they're trying to find the parents, and the parents are probably looking for their children. I can't imagine that there's been any plan for how to take care of them financially over the years to come. But they're here in this country and they're going to need a lot of help. Because for most of those children, and some have been there for 5 years or longer, they'll never trust an adult. Never. And they'll always be looking for what's going to happen to them next. There'll be a lack of a sense of being stable, of being permanent, of being trusting, of building relationships. And somewhere down the line, they'll even be penalized for that. So we've got a lot of work to do. We can go to the next slide. So there's different types of trauma. Direct traumatic stress is that impacts you living within a society of structural racism. We're part of that society and nobody gets a pass. It may seem that it's just happening to Black people, but that's a misnomer. I'm talking to white parents. I'm talking to Asian parents. I'm talking to immigrant parents. And they're all concerned about the direct trauma that they experience directly. The victims of individual physical and verbal attacks and other, what they call microaggressions. You know what? I don't even like that term, microaggressions. Because, Okoyeman, I'll ask you this question. When somebody says something off-placing to you, and at your age, it started happening from the time you can remember, what's micro about that today?
I have resisted that word as well, as I think Maria and others will know. I remember very well when it was first introduced and have felt uncomfortable with it. But just recently, and I think it was perhaps Monday on the Rachel Maddow show, Rachel had a doctor on, an African-American doctor. I don't remember what institute he was associated with, but given that he was on her program, it was certainly a very credible institution. And he said that in his practice, uh, uh, any African American who comes in, he gives them it's an 8-point survey asking them what particular experiences they have had. And he has some research and publication on this. I want to go back to, I think it's Monday's program and find out who he is. But it, so, you know, in these 8 points, one of them might be, well, it would be one of those everyday kinds of happenings
Mm-hmm.
that he has so he has 8 of these that are identified. You know, which of these have you experienced? And maybe he has it, you know, in the last week or in the last day or something like that. So in regard to microaggressions, yeah, so I don't know. It's how. So one of them is that I have a real problem with is the assumption. Let's say that that I'm not smart or I'm not intelligent, and just shows up in so many different ways. You know who they're paying. So in class, you know, when I was in class, who would be called upon? Just assumption about your answers. You give an answer, you make a statement, and it's hardly paid attention to, and then the white student who comes after you says essentially the same thing, and it's accepted. So just so many things like that. You see it in people's looks, in their behavior, their attitudes. So you'll learn to pick that up and to identify, you know, there's something racial about that.
Right.
And it just one thing after the other, one thing after the other. Yeah, I can't go into a restaurant without thinking of race. I can't go into a store without thinking about race. So it's why? Because there are always implications of that. That is, you know, the seating of tables, the behavior of those who are attending you, and so wherever it is, you know, going up to a counter, whatever the counter might be, there's always race comes up as something that is triggering for me in regard to the expectation that I am not going to be treated in a respectful way. Why? Because of my experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it is true that time, it has been true in the past.
Multiple
So
times over.
yeah, multiple times. And so you're always geared up. You're always, in a sense, ready for a fight because of past experiences.
Yeah. And so that term may be micro to the person who's inflicting it, but the person who's receiving it has been hit in that same spot maybe 1,000 times. So what started out as a little pinch when I was a 5-year-old girl in kindergarten and trying to raise my hand to be seen and never being seen and experiencing that same thing at the age that I am now, it's not micro. I have a gaping hole somewhere in my being. So we need to think about these kinds of terms that we use associated with things. And I know I only have 10 minutes left, and I got at least, I don't know, another 10, 11 slides to go through. So vicarious stress is what we see. And we've all been stressed here lately looking at the reenactment of the George Floyd video, going through the Chauvin case, whether we were listening to it or not, you could feel something in the air. When I think about the Latinx youth that have immigrated to the US, and they're reporting one traumatic experience after the other. And even if it didn't happen to them, they've seen it happen. I saw two little boys who were somewhere outside the border, who had notes in their pockets and in their hats of how to get to friends. And they only had themselves, but because of the kindness and the hearts of the others that were with them, they took care of them. The next day, I saw a little 9 or 11-year-old young immigrant who had been coming with a group of people, and they walked off and left him. He woke up and he was by himself. That was extremely traumatizing for him, and he'll never forget that. And then there's this transmitted traumatic stress, and refers to the traumatic stressors that are transferred from one generation to the next. And that's what I'm talking about, that none of us have escaped. The enslavement of my family, the enslavement of all Black people. We haven't gotten away from that. We haven't gotten away from Native Americans haven't gotten away from the fact that not only were robbed of the land, they wanted to rob them of their culture. They were robbed of their native language. They were robbed of the ways in which they cared for themselves, using real herbs and things that grew up, and never having the diseases that were brought to them. So we've all experienced these 3 types of trauma. Next slide. So what is the real betrayal of race? And it is a betrayal. People of color have been betrayed because they want us to think that we don't have any personal or group identity other than what they say or purport us to be. People of color, because of our race, there's high visibility. And I hate to keep saying for Black people, but Black people are constantly in high visibility with anything that happens. And there's not one of us, not one, when we see a shooting, when we see a robbery, that we don't say, I hope it's not somebody Black. Because why? Because we have been deemed to be thugs and nothing of value. The betrayal of race leaves us in a place where we know we're not accepted. Some of us are seeking acceptance, not only from other folks, but within our own group. The betrayal of race says that if you have a degree, if you speak a certain language, if you live in the right neighborhood and have the right car, then you've made it. According to who and according to what standard? The betrayal of race robbed me of my connection to my ancestors on the continent of Africa. The betrayal of race left so many of us with little or no social capital. And what does it mean to have social capital? It means that I'm connected to people. I'm connected in a way that no matter if I didn't have a job or I lose my good job, I'm connected enough that I can make a call. I'm connected enough that it's not an issue. The betrayal of race says that I have to piecemeal my history together in spite of the fact that I have a shared history with many of our ancestors who were enslaved. I have to piecemeal my way back to my beginnings, to the continent of Africa, if I want. And for white people, white, what is that? That's a color. I've been in so many sessions when we talk about who are you? And most Black people are going to say I'm African American and I do X, Y, and Z. White people don't say I'm white. The betrayal is that that they are accepted and they're right. The betrayal is that they're all privileged because they're white. Not true. The betrayal is that they have all the social capital. And for some, that is very, very true. But for others, it's not so much. The betrayal is that they really don't have a shared history. They have a shared history of what it took for them to be white in America. And now they have a shared history about what side of right and wrong are they going to be in. And the betrayal of race makes them think that they have everything belongs to them, and that they have true freedom. None of us in America have true freedom. Next slide, please. So when you're recognizing race-based trauma, I always say, who do you see? And how do you see people of color? How do you respond to people of color as an individual, as a professional, as a parent? How do you even discuss race? I've been challenging my white colleagues and the few white people that I call friends. I've been challenging them when this issue of race comes up, not only in your family, but among your colleagues, and people are saying off-colored things. What are you saying? How are you responding? And my thing is, I want folks to understand I love people. I don't hate people. But unless we challenge people that all humanity matters, then I'm on the wrong side. And so are you, if you're not challenging people just about the right to live because I'm a human being. Because spiritually, I believe I was created in God's image. That's a whole nother conversation. What does God look like? And why do we have a blue-eyed, blonde Jesus hanging somewhere? And most of history tells us that man came from the continent of Africa. Whole nother conversation. Next slide, please.
Bobby, if I may,
Yes.
recognizing we have 2 minutes, I want you to know that we would love to have you back. And Maria can help us, or Blake can help us with the programming, maybe the week after next, or at least in the upcoming, at a point in the upcoming week that you are free and you have other slides, and we can pick up from there. And I'm wondering if in the minute or so, couple of minutes that might remain, that maybe there might be a question among those who are listening, or a question that has already come in to Blake. What do you think, Bobby?
I'm good with answering a question. Now we got 1 minute. Have there come any questions, Blake?
Not through YouTube.
Not through the chat either. Oh, wait.
Anything from Trista or Vicky?
Vicky says it would be great to have a follow-up program. Thanks so much.
Yeah, and I see that we only got to slide 13 out of about 23. So
Okay.
that would make for a great second half.
It would be.
I'm sorry that I talked so much,
No,
but I think it's important to get to what it is versus rushing through.
Yes.
It's been great. And we could encourage people to watch this before the next one.
Right.
Okay.
I had so many questions come up. I just didn't want to interrupt.
Well, that's why we have a dialogue. So
I know. The format is so weird. Yeah.
So I can start.
Would have happened.
I can start with this slide or a previous slide next time that I am on.
Okay.
And I will put in some more slides next time that speak to what is meant by epigenetics and neurobiology.
Great.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby. Much appreciated for this session. I have gained some insights and perspectives, ways of looking at certain areas of race and trauma that, I never thought of in the past. And so I look forward to our upcoming conversations.
Mhm. And let's all try and promote this, widely on our networks.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Thank you so much, Bobby.
You're welcome.
We'll be in contact in regard to what your schedule might allow.
Okay. Thank you so much. I wish you all the best. Be safe.
Thank you.
Yes. Good night.